Hi there. Hey, this is our third lecture video, I think, on frameworks of power and how power influences how we think of social problems. Um, so this is all about kind of the impact of corporations and powerful social structures, and it kind of builds on what we were talking about in the last video about paradigms, especially the conflict paradigm and political spectrums and how they help shape social problems. So let's dive right into it. So the first piece of this is the notion of the concentration of corporate power, or what is commonly referred to as monopoly capitalism. The idea of capitalism, the John Smith capitalism that we think is the best way for capitalism to work, is where there's lots of competition. When there's lots of people vying for your dollar, and they are trying to make the best product at the low price. And the more competition, the better, because they're sort of competing against each other. So they're making better products and they're keeping their price low because they want your dollar. The problem is the tendency of capitalism is to sort of concentrate, meaning there's fewer and fewer competitors in the market. So if you know anything about the crime of price fixing, for example, price fixing is often when there's very little competition in the market and the few remaining competitors get together and fix the price of a product. So for example, the oil companies, the top four oil companies did this in the 1980s and netted billions of dollars and looted the American people at the gas pump every single day. So when we talk about the concentration of corporate power, what we're really talking about are a couple different things. Three different things I'm going to focus on. One is the what we call mega mergers, sort of one company buying another company. It's kind of common. People might be old enough to remember Coffee People, a great little Portland-based coffee shop that was really popular here in the 1990s. It was bought by Starbucks. Seattle's Best, bought by Starbucks. And so a big company will sort of gobble up smaller companies and reduce the amount of competition there is in the market. There are fewer places to go to get a cup of coffee, because the competition is now Starbucks and Starbucks. And so we have these mega mergers in which you have a handful of very large corporations that own multiple corporations under them that channel the flow of information. I'll give you an example, and I'm going to include a link in the description of the video and maybe give you a good infogram about the top 6 sources of information that we get. But for example, General Electric, GE, big, we think of them as a big power company. GE owns NBC, 14 major TV channels, Telemundo, Universal Pictures and Studios, CNBC, MSNBC, Bravo, USA, A&E, that was all taken over by Comcast, that now owns everything that GE owned. They took it over in 2009. So Comcast is even bigger, has even bigger corporate plate. So that means a couple of different things. One is it reduces the competition, so we can't compete. I remember in Atlanta we had 2 newspapers, the Atlanta Journal and the Atlanta Constitution. The Atlanta Journal bought the Constitution, so now there was only one newspaper in town, and that newspaper has now been bought by an outside corporation that's not even in Atlanta. So you reduce the competition. There's fewer places to go to. That concentration of power has power over unions, which means they can kick the unions out. They can pay people lower wages. They have influence over the governments. They have incredible amounts of power in the political realm. So they can determine policy, what policy gets attention and what policy gets shoved to the back or canceled. They just become incredibly powerful mega corporations. They can downsize jobs. We'll talk about it as this is part of the economic problem. A lot of those jobs become redundant. You don't need a accountant at NBC and the USA Network and Telemundo if they're owned by the same company. You just have one accountant, so that accountant loses their job. It increases the power of the corporations over the banks to borrow money from the banks. And this is one of the things that led to the 2008 recession that we had, that there was so much corporate debt from all this borrowing from the banks because the banks couldn't say no to these huge corporations. So it makes the economy more fragile, and they're not productive. They're just there to create profits, not to inform people. And so part of this, and I'm going to tell you why this is relevant to our class in a second. So part of this mega merger corporation is fewer and fewer outlets, right? The other part of this concentration of corporate power is what we call the interlocking directories. Their leadership is shared. The leadership or the board of directors at one corporation sits on the board of directors at another corporation. So they start to develop similar interests, and like one hand washing the other. The corporations are kind of looking out for each other, and of course they outsource their labor. They're shrinking those middle income jobs because they're no longer needed, because profit is the main thing. And so what happens when you have the concentration of corporate power with regards to social problems is the information about social problems gets controlled. It gets controlled by people who are mainly concerned about their profit. So a perfect example of this is in Texas. Texas is a big oil state. The oil companies have influence over what gets in the textbooks in the education system in Texas schools. And so, surprise, surprise, there's not a lot of information about global warming or about the environment and pollution. All that stuff gets scrubbed because there's so much control of information. And then when we go to the news, there's a decision about what's on the news. As they used to say, what's on the top of the fold of a newspaper for people who still read newspapers. What's the main headline, but what's the main story on the 6 o'clock news? These local and national news outlets are all owned by the same corporation, so they control the flow of the news. So therefore, we don't get a lot of information about income inequality. We don't get a lot of information about white-collar crime. We don't get a lot of information about toxic pollution by corporations and how that leads to high cancer rates. And we get information about celebrities and things that are meant to distract us. So the concentration of power has a huge impact on what we get to see, not what we choose to see, but what we get to see, because the flow of information from these big six companies really has a profit motive, and therefore limits our opportunity to see things that might actually be really important. And so there is a belief among some people that the media is liberal. You hear this a lot from the president, the liberal media. Well, there was a big study that came out in 2003 called What Liberal Media, and found that the media is actually the opposite of liberal. It's quite conservative. It reinforces a narrative that America is great and has solved all its problems. It reinforces a narrative that the more money that you make, the happier you will be. It reinforces a narrative about nationalism and patriotism. And in actuality, while there may be, a gay character here and there to say, oh, the media is liberal, in fact, the media overwhelmingly, not just the news, but programming in general, reinforces a narrative about black criminals and white saviors and money makes you happy. That is not a liberal narrative. The media is far from liberal. The media is corporate from this perspective and reinforces a corporate picture about the world, which is all organized around profits. So the concentration of power of media control really impacts what we see and understand as social problems. The internet has kind of tried to undo that, right? The internet sort of bubbles up underneath it, but the problem with the internet is you get stuff that is legitimate journalism that is reporting, including people like Vice that are sort of the new rebels in the journalist world. But you also get a lot of crap and a lot of news that's fake, and news that is coming from Russia, Russia Times, for example, and RT, and news that is completely pushing a particular political agenda, whether it's right wing or left wing. So the internet is a mixed bag, but even the internet is being controlled increasingly by corporate interest, with the end of sort of the free internet as we know it. And so in the context of this, I wanted to give you an important idea that impacts how we think about social problems, and that's this idea of globalization. Globalization is a process. It's a process of the interaction of people and companies and governments worldwide on a global scale. So the best way to think about globalization is about how you can go anywhere in the world now, almost anywhere. You can go anywhere in the world and have Pepsi. I was going to say you can go anywhere in the world and have a Coca-Cola. Cuba still bans Coca-Cola. I was in Cuba, in Havana, a few years ago, and the Cuba Libre is a great drink, and it's Pepsi and rum with a cigar. It's the best. Sitting in Havana, drinking Cuba Libres and daiquiris. It's a pretty good life. Anyway, you can go anywhere in the world pretty much and have a Coca-Cola, or anywhere in the world and see MTV and Starbucks. There's a Starbucks in the Great Wall of China. In the Great Wall of China, there's a Starbucks. We have a global economy, right? We care about the economic index in Japan, in Russia, in Greece. You know, how the Greek currency is doing impacts us. We have a global economy. And the global economy has existed really since the 1600s, since we really started trade with other countries. Global trade became more important than countries, right? Because you can put your money in a Swiss bank account pretty easily, right? You can invest in companies in Russia pretty easily. You can change your dollars for pounds pretty easily. So we have a global economy, and that global economy means that the global marketplace is important to us. What happens on a global scale, which is exciting, but also a little bit fragile. So World War One. Nobody really explains World War One very much. Nobody ever talks about World War One. World War One mattered, damn it. And World War One was about the collapse of empires, about these political empires, including Russia and Germany and Britain, that had these massive empires that were falling apart to make way for the unnational nature of capital, that money knows no boundaries. And it was really the collapse of that system that led to World War One, which set the stage for World War Two. So we have this global marketplace, globalization, and think about the easiest way to think about globalization is just go to the store. Just go to Walmart or Target or Fred Meyer and look where everything comes from. Very little of what we buy, including the electronics that we've been existing on, our phones and our laptops and our earbuds, is made in the United States. It's all made from somewhere else where the labor is cheap. It's expensive to make a car in the United States. It's a lot cheaper to make that car in Mexico, and it's even cheaper to make that car in China. It's expensive to make a computer. It's really expensive to make a computer in the United States. So let's just make it in Bangladesh, or at least outsource the parts for Bangladesh. We have a global economy that includes a global market and, of course, a global media. You know, we export Hollywood around the world, so everyone around the world loves to watch our movies. But, you know, we also watch telenovelas from Mexico and Bollywood movies from India. And, you know, we have a global market system that includes media as well. That's quite exciting. So why is this important? Well, first of all, one of the reasons this is important is that we focus kind of on the problems that impact us that might not impact people in other places more. What do I mean? Speaking of computers and phones, what happens when we throw them away? What happens when you're done with your phone and you're upgrading to a new flashier iPhone, or your laptop is broken and you got to buy a new laptop? What happens to your old laptop? Ever think about that? Well, it gets shipped off into the global marketplace and shipped to where toxic waste can be dealt with. Can toxic waste be dealt with in Alabama? Yeah, a little bit. I mean, they burn some toxic waste there, but where it's really dealt with for the most part is in places like Bangladesh and Western Africa, where we send all our e-waste that goes on top of huge piles, and children go through this toxic carnage of our old phones and laptops and look for metals that they can sell and have incredibly high cancer rates because they're in this sort of toxic dump all day. I'm going to include a link to a really great short documentary called E-Wasteland that kind of looks at the toxic city in a country in Africa called Ghana, where these things that we live on, I'm looking at my laptop right now, just end up in these big scrap heaps and kids dive through them. Because we are not in that part of the world economy, we don't see it. Out of sight, out of mind. So the issue of e-waste is not a problem. It is certainly a problem for people who live in Ghana. Our consumption is their cancer. But it's not a problem for us because of this global marketplace, because we have a nice place to dump all the stuff that's not in our backyard. We're not going to dump it in Washington County. We're going to dump it in Ghana. So the first point about globalization is it allows sort of the spreading of social problems globally. We could talk about sex trafficking in this class. I hope we have a little bit of time to talk about sex trafficking. But there is still slavery in the world. And a lot of that is coming out of Eastern Europe and Africa, Northern Africa, and places like Syria that are brutal rape and sexual exploitation, including of children. And it is the most ugly thing that you can ever imagine, including, body counts and children washing up on shores. Out of sight, out of mind, we don't see it because it's happening in another country. It's been sort of globalized out of the United States. So the first part is globalization kind of impacts how we see social problems and where we see social problems, and more importantly, where we don't see social problems. But the other thing is about how all this can change on a dime. So I'm going to give you a theory that is a real useful theory in talking about globalization. It's called world systems theory. World systems theory comes from this guy, Emanuel Wallerstein. And I wish I had a chalkboard to draw some stuff. Maybe I'll draw some stuff on my little kid's chalkboard. But what world systems theory argues is that there is a global economy, just like there's a national economy. And in the national economy, there's a class system. There's the, what Marx would call the bourgeoisie, the rich owners at the top. And then there's the proletariat, the working class, and between them there's a middle class, and then there's sort of the sub-poor people. Marx argued that you always have to have unemployed, homeless people because they will always work at a lower rate than the people who are working. So if the people who are working want to go on strike, they say, okay, you're fired. There's these homeless people that'll take the job for half the wage, so bye. And that on a global level, there's also a global class system. Just like the national economy has a national class system, the global economy has a global class system. And so we call the top countries that sort of run the economy. This is, instead of people, it's countries. The top countries, he calls those the core countries, the core nations. The United States would be one. Britain would be one. Germany would be one. Sometimes they're called the G8, the group of 8. That are the top core countries. I'll pass the current G8 on the board because I can never remember them all. It shifts a little bit. You have the core countries at the top. At the bottom, the sort of working class people who work in the factories. Those are the periphery nations. Those are the nations like I guess Bangladesh is now one. Vietnam definitely is one. Brazil is still one, where a lot of stuff is made. They are the workers of the world. They are the working class. We call them third world countries, because they're sort of on the bottom and they're doing the work. In between the third world countries, the periphery countries, and the core countries, the bourgeois countries, are the semi-periphery countries, the countries where they're sort of doing a little bit, they're kind of a little bit middle class and they're trying to move up. And so Brazil has moved up into that category, and Greece has moved up into that category. And there are countries that are middle class that are ascending. There are also countries that have moved down. Ireland was having a great run, and they've been sort of sinking in the European economy. Britain, we're going to see what happens with Britain. And so there is this semi-periphery. And then at the very bottom, there is a term that you might not think of it, like fourth world countries. But fourth world countries are the underdeveloped countries. So if you think about the countries of East Africa, like Somalia and Ethiopia and Eritrea, they are at the very bottom. They're the place where the toxic waste goes. And they are the place where the next wave of workers might come from. So if Vietnam goes on strike, they'll just move that Nike factory, Nike, made in Vietnam, they'll just move that Nike factory to Ethiopia. There's lots of cheap labor in Ethiopia. Those people are literally starving to work. And so you have a global class system and global exploitation. The rich benefit off the labor of the poor. A lot of our food comes from third world countries. We give them loans and say, hey, shave this Amazon rainforest down so we can get some canola oil out of it in Sumatra, and coffee beans and sunflower oil, and they can't feed themselves, but they have to do it to get the aid for schools and the aid for infrastructure from the countries at the top. So there's this exploitation. So the first part of world systems theory is the social problems that you associate with classes in America are also going to be associated with countries in the world system. Countries at the bottom, Vietnam, Bangladesh, are going to have a lot of the problems associated with poverty that we see associated with America, including lack of education, lack of health care, more sexual exploitation, slavery, and the countries that are at the core are going to have fewer of those problems. So on a global scale. So the important point here is there's a global class system, and the problems that we associate with the bottom of the American class system, these countries that are at the bottom, and I'll include a chart or a graph in here that helps you see this visually, because otherwise I'd be writing it around on various chalkboards in the room. But the other part of this is, according to Wallerstein, who kind of created this theory, there are patterns within the world system. So the American economy, as we know, goes up and down, right? We have times of great expansion. The late 40s, early 50s were great in America. We were really growing. The post-war boom. Everybody was moving to the suburbs and buying a new car and getting a new toaster oven. There was, the economy was going up. And often we use the Dow Jones, which is an index on the New York Stock Exchange, to show how the economy is going up, or the GDP, the gross domestic product, to show how the economy is going up. But we also know it goes down, right? The Great Depression that started in 1929, the economy tanked and everybody was thrown out of work. The Great Recession of 2008, the economy tanked and so many people were thrown out of work and so many people lost their houses. We've just been climbing out of that through the Obama years, and now we're sinking back into it now thanks to Trump and COVID. It can go up and down, and we experience this in our life. There are good times and there are bad times, and one of the things we talk about in intro sociology is the Dow Jones, how well the stock market is doing is a great predictor of the birth rate in America. That we have pretty good data that shows when the Dow Jones is going up, 9 months later, more babies are being born. Because people feel good about the future and, hey, let's get busy and have, obviously some people have babies because, oops, I did it again, and we're having another kid, and they weren't thinking about the economy. But a lot of people, put a lot of thought into, I know we did. We were like, things like they're going well. Maybe let's have a baby. Okay, let's have a baby. Let's try on Tuesday. Yeah. Not everybody does that. But also when the economy goes down, surprise, surprise, 9 months later, the birth rate goes down because things are scary and people are losing their jobs. And there's a lot of people that think that the COVID thing is going to cause a birth rate because everybody's shacked up and in lockdown. 9 months later, we're going to have a bunch of COVID babies. But the odds are, based on past patterns, because the economy went down with everything else, is that all those people are like, don't get pregnant because you just lost your job. And so, anyway. That's the economy on a national scale. What Wallerstein found was that there was a trend in the global economy as well. Okay, here's where I'm going to try to draw something on my handy-dandy chalkboard. That the economy, if we really go back, and part of my first graduate work, before I started studying racist skinheads, was studying the birth of the global economy in the 1600s. We have data to go all the way back to the 1600s to show that there are rises and falls of the global economy. They're called K waves or Kondratiev waves, which I'll put up on the screen so you know. But basically, the global economy looks like this, just like the national economy. It goes up. This is good times. Yay, we're making a lot of money. And then it crashes. And we go into depression. And it goes up and it goes down. And these K waves are about 30 years up. 30 years up and down. 30 years. 30 years. So we have, this is basically a 100-year picture of the global economy right here. And what they found in studying these kind of global waves of expansion and contraction, the global economy is doing pretty good. The global economy is tanking. It's doing pretty good. It's tanking. That after every third wave, there's a new king of the hill. There's a country that we would call the global hegemon, the country that is at the top, that determines kind of what goes on in the rest of the world. So for a while, the global hegemon was Spain. And for 100 years, Spain ruled. The Spanish Armada determined everything that kind of came out of Europe. And then after about 100 years, it crashed. And then we got the British Empire. In the 1800s, they would say the sun never sets on the British Empire because they had India and Bermuda, and they had colonies in the Americas, were originally British colonies. They had colonies all over the place. What happened to those colonies? Ask Gandhi about India. The sun never sets on the British Empire. You go to London now and they call it the 51st state because it's all McDonald's and Starbucks. So in World War I happens, 1918. and we enter World War I, and that's the beginning of the American century. America becomes the new global hegemon. America rules the 20th century. Everybody, is doing everything American. We're wearing Levi's and drinking Coca-Cola and watching Hollywood movies, and the whole world is focused on what America wants. And the President of the United States is also the de facto leader of the world, of the global economy. 100 years, 1918, guess where we are right now? So as the global economy collapses, then the prediction is that there's a new global hegemon for the next roughly 3 waves or 100 years. And that, my friends, is a country that you might guess is doing pretty well right now, while we're all contracting and losing our jobs and having a president who doesn't know what he's doing. They are consolidating power. And that country is, does anybody want to guess? That's right, China. China is ascending, moving from originally third world, second world, and now in the first world is positioned to be the next global hegemon. That the 21st century, now that we're 100 years past World War I, will probably be China. And we're going to be learning to speak Chinese and eating with chopsticks, and everything is going to be Sino-centered, Chinese-centered, and that is going to be the shot caller in the world. But what does that mean about social problems? That means that the social problems that affect China are the ones that we're going to pay attention to. And we may end up, as we drop down, dealing with their toxic waste. The stuff that they don't want to deal with, it gets sent to us because we've been demoted. We're moving down the ranks. I mean, we'll see what happens, especially with the election. But we're sort of moving down the ranks. And so that's going to change how we see social problems. So world system theory allows us to see how the world is organized economically, but also how these patterns impact how we see the world, including how dominant our country is. A lot of people are moving to the United States. 50 years from now, we might be sneaking across the border into Mexico because Mexico rises and we fall. Very possible. Not necessarily a bad thing. I love sneaking into Mexico. Okay, the last thing I want to say about this sort of concentration of power business is about the notion of special interest groups. And this is really something that impacts how we see social problems. What do I mean by special interest groups? Special interest groups are organizations that seek to influence power around a specific issue. And there are all kinds of special interest groups. There are ones that you care about or care about things that you care about. They care about racial justice. There are ones that care about things you might not care about. Trade with Italy. I don't know how much you care about trade with Italy, but there's a special interest group that wants to create favorable trade policy with Italy. There are ones that are very, very narrow, like the National Rifle Association. It's focused mainly on the expansion of gun access and defeating gun control laws. They are a special interest group. There are special interest groups around the environment. And so they work on kind of 2 different levels, special interest groups. And again, these help us to not only shape our ideas about social problems, but actually what gets done with them in the form of policy. The first way that special interest group work is with lobbying. Lobbying is a way of influencing our elected officials. So remember how we talked about how Republicans and Democrats have sort of a different idea about how they should govern. Democrats want to represent their constituents. Republicans want to act for their constituents and are supposed to be the smart people in the room. There's a lot going on in Washington. There's a lot of policies, and it's just a lot. I can't imagine being elected. I mean, somebody like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who was elected when she was 27 or 28. How overwhelming that job is. I've been to Washington D.C. many times, and I know I don't want that job. It's too much. Of course, they have a lot of people to help them, and some of those people are people that work for them. So let's say there's a bill coming up about gun control. We've had all these school shootings, and I might have my people say, go do some research so I can make an informed opinion on this upcoming bill. But also, special interest groups will lobby, which literally means go to the lobby. I mean, now it can be done online or virtually, but in the old days, you would go to the lobby. And I'll give you an example, because as a 19-year-old, I worked as a lobbyist in Washington, D.C. It was such an eye-opening experience. I worked for a nuclear freeze nonprofit. We were trying to stop the production of nuclear weapons because we didn't want the world to blow up. 1983, 19-year-old Randy going to Washington, D.C., full of vim and vigor, and I'm going to go talk to my representatives. I'm going to talk to my senators, and I'm going to talk to my congressmen and the House of Representatives, and I'm going to convince them not to vote for this bill that is going to put more federal tax dollars into the military budget to build nuclear weapons. That's my job. Save the world, Randy. So I'm in the lobby, boop, 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 dressed up. I didn't even bring a tie. I didn't even realize, how it worked. Have my little Emory University sweatshirt on, and I'm okay. I've got all my facts. I've got my information sheet. I'm going to talk to Senator Sam Nunn of Georgia, and I sit in the lobby, and I sit there, and I sit there. While I'm sitting there, other lobbyists come in. Lobbyists for IBM, lobbyists for Israel, lobbyists for Hewlett-Packard, lobbyists for big corporations, a lobbyist for the NRA. They go right in and talk to Sam Nunn because they've got money, and you know what? They can take them out to lunch, and they can take them on a little vacation. Hey, let's go talk about this bill in my villa on the south of France. And I'm just sitting there, a little 19-year-old Randy, and finally, an assistant comes out and says, "What did you want to talk to the senator about?" And I'm like, I'm here for that. And they're like, "Okay, we'll write it down." And they said, "Well, tell them." And probably never told them that money bought access. Money bought access, and therefore money bought influence. And a lot of the times these lobbyists will actually write the legislation. The oil company lobbyists write a lot of the environmental legislation, not only in Texas, but for the federal government. They'll say, "We want a good environmental law to regulate oil companies? Here, we've written one for me. You don't have to do any of the work. We've done the work for you. Just sign off on it." So the lobbyists really help shape the policy that ends up actually being enacted to address social problems or prevent policies from even happening, including environmental policies. So the lobbyists work. And the other way that special interest groups work is through what are called PACs, which PAC stands for Political Action Committee. Running for office costs money. Money, costs millions of dollars to run for office. And, I feel sorry for the people in Congress, in the House of Representatives, because they have to run every 2 years. So as soon as you get there, you have to start running for re-election all over again. So where do you have time to do fundraising, to do all the stuff that you have to do for your re-election campaign? Well, don't worry, the PACs are here. They will give money to your re-election campaign and even hire people to run it for you. But for that money that you get, there's an expectation that, look, we helped you get reelected. You're going to pass this bill that we support, right? Or you're going to kill this gun control bill, or you're going to prevent this discussion from happening about police brutality, right? And so, that money buys access as well and buys influence. And so those politicians, those elected politicians, this happens on a local level too, not just in Washington, D.C., become beholden to the people who fund their campaigns, those political action committees. So therefore, that impacts the information that we see about special interest groups, but it also impacts how policies get enacted or don't get enacted, or how watered down do they get by the time these PACs have had their way with them. And so it makes it really hard for good legislation to really address the problems. We've already seen the influence of PACs and special interest groups trying to water down the police reform issues that we were all excited about 2 weeks ago, or already starting to be turned into just sort of meaningless legislation. And so those things are ways that power, include corporate power, the global economy, and special interest group, impact how we get to see social problems, how we get to learn about social problems, and how we get to enact policy about social problems. And it's kind of depressing when you think about it, because they're so powerful. But that's why we rise. That's why we keep struggling to make sure the voices of the powerless are heard. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of insight onto kind of the what we're up against in trying to get social problems seen and acted on. All right, that's the end of this, and I'll have a little question for you to answer at the end of this video. Okay, that's it.